Good day, everyone. So, this is another recorded discussion in the subject, the foundations of inclusive and special education. So, as you can see here, the first semester of the school year 2023-2024 has started and on last September, and we are still not done in discussing or finishing the all chapters of the coverage of the subject, the foundations of inclusive and special education. So, our target is to finish all the chapters, all the coverage of the final examination, and we will not set any timeline of how or when will be the final examination of these subjects. So, let's wait to finish all the coverage chapters of the final examinations. So, for the chapter 5, we will talk about the typical and atypical development among children. So, have you ever wondered how children develop, or maybe at one time you have compared your development with that of a sibling or a cousin of yours? If this is the case, you are interested in child development, which is the pattern of growth, change, and stability that occurs from conception up until adolescence. So children do not grow at the same rate at the same time. This also goes for the students in an inclusive classroom. Knowing their capabilities can help you better as their teacher. Find out more about their development as this chapter focuses on the typical and atypical development among children from infancy to adolescence. So the child development and its importance. So to ensure that the child meets his or her development milestone, it is crucial to observe and monitor his or her development. So the milestones or developmental skills that need to be mastered, usually at the same rate, act as a guide for ideal development. It is done by checking the progress of a child based on his or her age to see if the child is developing within expectations. So for others, checking the milestones can help detect any difficulties at a particular stage. Intervention can then be a given which can help in the development of a child. Usually, it is the parents, teachers, and pediatricians who use the checklist. In child development theory, so during the early 20th century, interest in child development began specifically that which focused on detecting abnormalities. So certain theories were discovered based on this interest to appreciate the growth that children experience from birth to adolescence. So let's now talk about the psychosocial development theory of Erik Erikson. So this is an eight-stage theory that describes the changes one goes through in a lifetime. So the main focus of Erickson's theory is the conflict or crisis one experienced through social interaction. So as you can see here, starting from the birth, each person is faced with a conflict, which is the mistrust, and that needs to be resolved since it has an impact on the function of the succeeding stage. So if one successfully overcomes the crisis of each stage, a psychological virtue emerges. So as you can see here in infancy, we have the trust or versus mistrust, the autonomy versus shame and doubt, the initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, the identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and integrity versus despair. So I believe that you are familiar with the stages of Erik Erikson. It was being discussed in your children and adolescent learners and learning principles subject. So let's now proceed to cognitive development theory of Jean Piaget. So this theory is concerned with the thought processes of a person and how they are used to understand and interact with the environment. So the Piaget's theory focuses on children's intellectual development and has four stages in a cognitive development. So we have the sensory motor stage that occurs from birth to 2 years old. So a child's knowledge is limited to his or her use of the senses. Next is we have the pre-operational stage. From 6 years old, a child learns through the use of language. So however, a mental manipulation of an information does not take place yet. Next is a concrete operational stage. From 7 to 11 years old, A child begins to think logically and have better understanding of mental operations. So, however, abstract and abstract concepts are still difficult to understand. So after the cognitive development theory of Jean Piaget, we have also the sociocultural theory of Lev Vygotsky. So this theory believes that children learn actively through hands-on experience. So Vygotsky highlights the importance of other people, such as parents, caregivers, and peers in the development of children. So culture plays an integral role as well. So interaction with others allows learning to be integrated in the child's understanding of the world. So also included in the theory is the zone proximal development. So which is the portion in between what one can do on his or her own and with the help. So children must learn with when they are in this zone. Next is the social learning theory of Albert Bandura. So this theory believes that learning takes place through observation and modeling. So as a child observes the action of the people in his or her environment, new information is acquired and new skills are developed. So those are the theories of the development. So we have the theory of Eric Erikson, the psychosocial development, and we have Jean Piaget with cognitive development theory, and Lev Vygotsky of social cultural theory, and Albert Bandura in his social learning theory. So let us now proceed to identifying the difference between the typical and atypical development. So the development of a child usually follows a predictable pattern. So there are certain skills and abilities that are observed to gauge of child's development are called development milestone. So example of this is sitting, bubbling, and following directions. However, each child is unique. With this, not all reach a milestone at the same time. Thus the terms atypical and atypical development. So let us now define the two terms first before we look further into what makes a child's development typical and atypical. In atypical development, this refers to the normal progression where children grow by acquiring knowledge, skills, and a behavior that called developmental milestone. While on atypical development, this is a term used when development does not follow the normal course. So more so, a child is developing atypically when she reaches a milestone earlier or later than other children his or her age. So there is no clear way to identify a child is developing typically or atypically. However, there are three commonly accepted principles of a child development that one should look into. So these are the principles. Number one is rate of development differs from children. Development occurs in a relatively orderly process and development takes place gradually. So let's now proceed to the domains of development. So the developmental milestones are categorized into four domains, namely the physical, social, emotional, language, and cognitive. So in the physical domain, this refers to the development of physical changes such as the size and strength. So the development occurs in both gross and fine motor skills. So the development of the senses and their uses are also part of the physical domain, which is influenced by illness and nutrition. Next is we have the social and emotional. So the child's experience, expression, and management of emotions, along with the ability to establish positive relationship with others, refer to this domain. So this includes both the intrapersonal and interpersonal process that takes place in a child. Next is we have the language domains. So in language domains, this refers to the process of acquiring language in a consistent order. So meaning this without the need for explicit teaching from the environment. Next is we have the cognitive domain. So this is the construction of thought process, which includes remembering, problem solving, and decision making. So those are the four domains of development. So we have the physical domain, social and emotional, language domain, and cognitive domain. So let us now proceed to the stages in child development. So the stages along with age are used as ranges to mark significant periods in a human development timeline. So in each stage, growth and development occur in the four domains mentioned above. So these are the stages. We have the infancy, that is birth to 2 years old. We have the early childhood, 3 years old to 8 years old. And we have the middle childhood, which is 9 to 10 years old. And we have the adolescence, 12 to 18 years old. So let us now first discuss the typical and atypical um aspect of the infancy. So, infancy is birth to 2 years old. This is a critical stage in a child development because growth is rapid. So, many believe that this stage is the most important stage in one's life since the changes that occur in infancy will affect the later stages of the development. So, this stage is also known as the building block for the succeeding stages in the attainment of crucial knowledge, skills, and behaviors. So, we will identify now the typical and atypical developmental milestone in the infancy stage. When it comes to physical domains, the typical in infancy stage is that they holds head without support, pushes legs down when feet are on flat surface, and rolls over, sits without support, crawls, walking, and begins to run, as you can see here in our picture. The atypical is that they does not help, they do not hold head up, they do not put weight on legs, and cannot sit without the support, and do not walk steadily, just like this young man. Next is the when it comes to socio-emotional, they smiles at people, likes to play, shy or afraid of strangers, cries when caregiver leaves, and copies other and show independence. While the typical is does not smile, shows no affection, and does not recognize familiar people. When it comes to language, they make cooing and bubbling sounds. They respond to own name and makes different sounds and responds to simple requests and tries to say words and say sentences. In a typical, they do not coo and babble. They do not say a single word and they do not speak in a sentences. On the cognitive domain, so they watch a thing as they move, and use eyes and hands together and recognize people at a distance. They transfer objects from one hand to another and explore things in various ways and use things correctly, even for example in eating with spoon and fork, and finds hidden things. In a typical, they do not watch things as they move and they do not know what to do with the common objects. So those are the typical and atypical when it comes to um, domains of developmental milestones. So let us now proceed to early childhood. This occurs during the 3 to 8 years old. This is a period of life with slow growth and rapid development. So most psychologists label this stage as the exploratory and questioning stage since the children enjoy discovering new things in their surroundings. So interactions with family and the people around them will help shape their development. So let's now proceed in identifying the different domains, whether it is a typical or atypical. For physical domain, for typical, they runs well, they climbs easily and hops and stands on one foot and can use toilet on his or her own. And the atypical is that they falls down often, needs help in the physical activities. In a social emotional, they shows affection, takes turns in games, cooperate with other children, show concern and sympathy, and shows more independence. While on a typical, does not want to play with others and usually withdrawn. When it comes to language, in a typical manner, they follows 2 to 3 step instructions, uses pronouns, tells and retells stories, and speak clearly. And an atypical has a clear speech and can tell stories articulately or articulately. In a cognitive manner, they plays make-believe, works with simple toys, names colors and numbers, draws a person, names letters, show development of mental skills. For atypical, does not play with simple toys or make-believe and loses skills once had. In a middle childhood, this occurs during 9 to 11 years old that brings various changes in a child's life. So independence is a characteristic that children in this stage asserts. So developing friendships in another milestone that is evident in this stage. So children should be given more tasks to develop their sense of responsibility to further develop their growing independence. So in terms in the physical domains, and under the typical, growth sport may take place, becomes clumsy, increase in appetite, and in atypical has a limited mobility. In a socio-emotional, under the typical, they forms stronger friendships, becomes aware of body changes due to puberty, and shows more concern about looks and may feel stressed about schoolwork. In an atypical has difficulty making and keeping friends. On language, they continues to speak clearly and expresses one's thought articulately, and a typical is has a clear speech and can tell stories articulately. In a cognitive domain, under the typical, is that they increase attention span, sees the view of other people more clearly, while on the atypical, experiences problems with comprehension and attention and unable to keep up with the school's curriculum. So the last stage would be the adolescence that occurs 12 to 18 years old. So this is a period where puberty begins. By the end of this stage, most will have complete puberty. So the child is now called a teen during this stage. So the teen is becoming more vocal about his or her opinions due to the development of a unique personality. So peer pressure, however, will be present, which is why guidance from parents and guardians is very much needed. So for the physical domains, and atypical reaches adult weight and height, and atypical is limited mobility. In a socio-emotional, under the typical is that um, becomes interested in opposite sex, begins conflict with parents, and shows more independence from parents, while in a typical has a limited peer connections, may exhibit inappropriate behavior in public. So in a language domain, and under the typical development is that continues to speak clearly, expresses one's thought articulately, and under the atypical development is that has unclear speech and can tell stories articulately. In the last domain, which is the cognitive domain, under the typical development, is that they acquire and uses defined work habits and shows concern about the future. In a typical development, this is below grade level. So behaviors that are atypical should be observed keenly and recorded carefully. So at times, the recorded observations might just be isolated events with no significant impact on later development. However, they might also be early warning signs of needs. So the observed patterns will be useful to confirm if there is such a need. So that's all for chapter 5 recorded discussion. So let's proceed to your performance activity. So answer the following questions. This consists of 60 points. Put your answer in the comment section below by following the format. So you have to put your name first, the block or cluster, answer, and the deadline of submission is on October 3, 2023, 8 p.m. only. So number 1 is share the various child development theories and discuss each. And what are the various child development theories in relation to the different milestone of each stage? And enumerate and discuss the various domains of development. So again, thank you very much for watching and studying the chapter 5 in our subject, the foundations of inclusive and special education. So again, I will announce the schedule of your quiz and Again, no personal message, and I want to remind again, all over again, I don't accommodate and I don't reply in a person using your personal account to my personal account. So if you have any questions, clarifications, just chat it in our official group chat. So again, thank you very much and see you in our next discussion.